Sometimes a mother's love means making the hardest choice of her life. Sometimes it means letting go to save what matters most. In 1887, Martha Keene stood at her cabin door, watching her breath freeze in the bitter air as she made a decision that would break her heart. Her husband was dead, her debts were crushing her family, and the cruel storekeeper wanted payment she couldn't give. So she offered him her youngest daughter Annie in trade to the mountain man Elias Ward. Everyone said Elias was cold and mean, a man who never talked to people, but when he took little Annie's hand, he didn't take her away. He gave her a warm blanket and a silver locket. Then he surprised Martha with a bag of gold dust to pay all her debts. He said he once lost a daughter Annie's age. But what made him choose kindness over cruelty? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Pine Hollow wasn't much to look at, even in the best of times. The settlement clung to the mountainside like a stubborn patch of lichen, its handful of weathered buildings huddled together against the endless wind that swept down from the peaks. But in the winter of 1887, with snow piled higher than a man's head and ice coating every surface like nature's own prison bars, Pine Hollow felt like the loneliest place on God's green earth. Martha Keene pressed her face to the frost-covered window of her small cabin, watching the morning sun struggle through the grey clouds. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned to endure, but the lines around her eyes spoke of sorrows that aged her beyond her years. Her dark hair, once lustrous and carefully arranged, now hung in a simple braid down her back, practical, unadorned, like everything else in her life had become since Samuel died. The cabin around her told its own story of gradual decline. What had once been a modest but comfortable home now showed the wear of a family struggling to survive. The wooden floors, polished smooth by Samuel's careful hands, were now scuffed and worn. The cheerful yellow curtains Martha had sewn during her first hopeful months as a bride hung faded and patched. Even the smell of the place had changed, where once it carried the warm scents of fresh bread and Samuel's pipe tobacco. Now it held only the sharp bite of wood smoke and the mustiness of dampness that wouldn't quite dry. Samuel's mining tools still hung on the wall beside the door, exactly where he had left them 6 months ago. The pickaxe showed years of hard use, its wooden handle worn smooth by calloused hands, the metal head nicked and scarred from countless strikes against stubborn rock. Beside it hung his gold pan, its bottom blackened from years of hopeful sifting along the creek beds that threaded through the mountains. Martha couldn't bring herself to move them, though their presence was a daily reminder of dreams that had died with their dreamer. "Mama, there's no more milk." The small voice belonged to Annie, Martha's youngest, a wisp of a girl with cornflower blue eyes and hair the color of summer wheat. At 6 years old, Annie had her father's gentle nature and her mother's quiet strength. But lately, she had grown too thin, her clothes hanging loose on her small frame. Martha turned from the window and knelt beside her daughter, smoothing the child's hair with hands that trembled slightly from the morning cold. "I know, sweetheart. We'll have to make do with water in our oats today." From the small table where he sat whittling a piece of pine, 14-year-old Tom looked up with the serious expression that had settled on his face since becoming the man of the house. He had Samuel's broad shoulders and steady hands, but at 14 they still belonged to a boy, forced to carry a man's burden. "Mrs. Henderson might spare some milk if I help her with the wood chopping." "You've already done too much for the neighbors," Martha replied, though her heart swelled with pride at her son's willingness to help. "They have their own families to feed." 10-year-old Sarah, the quiet observer of the family, continued mending a tear in her dress without looking up. She had always been the thoughtful one, more likely to watch and listen than to speak. But Martha had noticed how her daughter's artwork had grown darker lately, sketches of bare trees and empty plates instead of the cheerful flowers and birds she used to draw. The sound of heavy boots on the wooden porch made them all freeze. In Pine Hollow, unexpected visitors usually brought bad news, and Martha's family had received more than their share lately. She rose slowly, her hand instinctively going to Samuel's old rifle hanging above the door, though she had never learned to use it properly. "Mrs. Keene, it's Jeremiah Polk. I need a word." Martha's stomach clenched at the name. Polk owned the general store that served as Pine Hollow's lifeline to the outside world, but more importantly, he held the debts that were slowly strangling her family. A thin, sharp-featured man in his 50s, Polk had the unfortunate combination of a small man's ambition and a cruel man's heart. He had been patient after Samuel's death for about a month. Since then, his visits had grown more frequent and his demands more pressing. She opened the door to find Polk stamping snow from his boots, his narrow face pinched with cold and irritation. Behind him, his breath formed white clouds in the bitter air. "Mr. Polk, rather early for a visit, isn't it? Business doesn't keep bankers' hours, Mrs. Keene. May I come in?" This cold is brutal enough to freeze a man's thoughts solid. Martha stepped aside reluctantly, watching as Polk entered and surveyed the sparse interior with calculating eyes. She had seen that look before the way a man assessed property he was considering claiming. "Coffee?" she offered, knowing she could barely spare it. "No need for pleasantries." Polk settled into Samuel's old chair without invitation, a liberty that made Tom's jaw tighten visibly. "I've come about the matter we discussed last week. The debt situation has reached a point where I can no longer extend credit in good faith." Martha remained standing, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their shaking. "How much time do I have?" "I'm afraid the time for extensions has passed. Your husband's account shows $73.42 owed. That includes the supplies from last month, the medicine for little Annie's fever, and the credit I extended for your husband's funeral arrangements." The number hit Martha like a physical blow. $73 might as well have been $700 for all her ability to pay it. In Pine Hollow, where a good day's work might earn a man $2 if he was lucky, such a sum represented months of prosperity she couldn't imagine achieving. "I have some items I could sell," she began, but Polk was already shaking his head. "Mrs. Keene, I've been patient because I respected your husband. Samuel was a good man, even if he wasn't the most practical when it came to business matters. But I have my own responsibilities, my own bills to pay. The supply train from Denver won't extend me credit if I can't collect what's owed." Annie had crept closer to her mother during this exchange, and now she pressed against Martha's leg, sensing the tension even if she didn't understand its full meaning. Martha's hand found the child's head, offering what comfort she could, while her mind raced through possibilities, each one more hopeless than the last. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Polk?" The storekeeper's smile was thin and humorless. "I'm prepared to forgive the debt in exchange for the cabin and the mining claim. You and the children can find arrangements elsewhere, perhaps with relatives back east." "This is our home." Tom's voice was tight with anger, but Martha silenced him with a look. "We have no relatives and no means to travel east, even if we did." Martha kept her voice steady, though inside she felt as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff. "Surely there must be another arrangement we could make." Polk leaned back in the chair, studying her with the patience of a man who held all the advantages. "There is one possibility. I've heard tell that Elias Ward might be willing to take on some domestic help. He's been asking around about finding someone to keep house for him up at his place in the high country." Martha had heard the name, though she had never seen the man himself. Elias Ward was something of a legend in Pine Hollow, a mountain man who lived alone in the wilderness, coming to town perhaps once a month for supplies. The stories about him varied depending on who was telling them, but they all agreed on certain points. He was rough, unsociable, and preferred the company of his horses and pack mules to that of people. "What kind of arrangement are you suggesting?" "Well, you've got 3 children, and winter makes for long, lonely months in the mountains. Ward's got more gold dust than he knows what to do with from his trapping and prospecting. Seems to me a practical woman might find a way to benefit them both. 2. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a green fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Martha felt Tom tense beside her, his hands clenching into fists, while Sarah looked up from her, mending with wide, frightened eyes. "You're suggesting I hire myself out as a housekeeper?" Martha's voice was carefully controlled, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm suggesting you consider all your options, Mrs. Keene. A woman in your position can't afford to be too particular about the work she's willing to do." Polk's meaning was clear enough, wrapped in words that maintained a thin veneer of respectability. Martha's mind reeled. The thought of leaving her children to work for a strange man in the mountains was terrifying enough, but Polk's suggestion carried implications that made her stomach turn. Yet what choice did she have? The debt was real, the winter was brutal, and her children's faces grew thinner each day. "I couldn't leave the children alone." "Well now, that presents a challenge." Polk scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Ward's not likely to want a whole family cluttering up his place. He's particular about his privacy. But perhaps he might consider taking one of them as additional help, kitchen work, tending horses, that sort of thing." The words hit Martha like ice water. He was suggesting she not only sell herself into service, but bring one of her children along as well. The casual way he discussed it, as if her children were livestock to be bartered, made her feel sick. "Which one did you have in mind?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. "The little one might be most suitable, less likely to cause trouble, and Ward seems to have a soft spot for youngsters. I've seen him slip candy to children when he thought no one was looking." Annie looked up at her mother, with complete trust, unaware that her fate was being discussed like a business transaction. Martha's heart broke, looking at that innocent face, those trusting blue eyes that still believed Mama could fix anything. "I need time to consider this." Polk stood, brushing imaginary dust from his coat. "Of course, but don't take too long, Mrs. Keene. Winter won't wait for anyone's decision, and my creditors won't wait for mine." After he left, the silence in the cabin was deafening. Tom was the first to speak, his young voice cracking with emotion. "Mama, you can't seriously be thinking about this." Martha sank into her chair, suddenly feeling every one of her 32 years and more. "I don't see that we have much choice, son. There has to be another way. I could find work in the next town over. Or, you're 14 years old." Martha's voice was gentle but firm. "You shouldn't have to carry this burden." Sarah finally looked up from her mending. "What's going to happen to us, Mama?" It was Annie's question, asked in that innocent way children had of cutting straight to the heart of things, that nearly broke Martha's composure. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I promise you, whatever happens, we'll face it together." The afternoon passed in a haze of desperate calculations and impossible choices. Martha went through their meager possessions again and again, searching for something of value she might have overlooked. Samuel's tools, worn though they were, might fetch a few dollars. Her wedding ring, thin gold that had belonged to Samuel's mother, could bring perhaps $5 if she could bear to part with it. Even selling everything they owned wouldn't come close to covering the debt. As evening approached and the cabin grew cold despite the fire, Tom kept feeding. Martha faced the truth she had been avoiding all day. She had no choice but to approach Elias Ward. The only question remaining was which child she would have to sacrifice to save the others. The thought of sending Tom made her heart ache. He was trying so hard to be the man of the family, but he was still just a boy who deserved a chance at childhood. Sarah, quiet and observant, might be able to handle the mountain life, but Martha couldn't bear the thought of her middle child's gentle spirit being crushed by harsh circumstances. That left Annie, sweet, trusting Annie, who had never known a world that wasn't safe and warm and full of love. The thought of handing her 6-year-old daughter over to a strange man in the wilderness felt like tearing out her own heart. But as Martha watched her children share their meager evening meal, dividing thin soup and hard bread with the careful attention of people who knew hungry days, she realized that love sometimes demanded the unthinkable. Sometimes, loving your children meant making choices that would haunt you forever. Outside, the wind howled through the pine trees, and snow began to fall again, adding to the drifts that already threatened to bury Pine Hollow completely. Winter was a harsh teacher, and Martha Keene was about to learn her hardest lesson yet, that survival sometimes came at a price no mother should ever have to pay. 3 days later, Martha stood at the edge of Pine Hollow's main street, clutching Annie's small hand while snow crunched beneath their boots. The morning air was so cold it seemed to crystallize in her lungs, but the chill she felt had little to do with the weather. Word had come that Elias Ward was in town, and this might be her only chance to approach him before he disappeared back into the mountains for another month. "Why are we going to see the mountain man, Mama?" Annie's voice was bright with curiosity rather than fear. At 6, she still believed the world was fundamentally good, that adults could solve any problem with enough effort and love. "We need to talk to him about some work I might do," Martha replied, the half-truth sticking in her throat like a bone. They found Elias Ward behind Peterson's stable, checking the shoes on a large bay mare. He was not what Martha had expected. The stories had painted him as some sort of wild man, but the figure before her was simply a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, dressed in well-worn but clean buckskins and a heavy wool coat. His dark hair, streaked with premature grey, was neatly trimmed, and his beard was more carefully groomed than those of most men who lived in town. What struck Martha most were his hands. As he lifted the mare's hoof to examine it, she could see they were strong and capable, but gentle with the animal. There was something about the way he moved, deliberate, calm, with no wasted motion that spoke of a man comfortable with solitude and self-reliance. On the ground beside him lay a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed with age and weather. Even from a distance, Martha could see it was filled with sketches, drawings of landscapes, animals, and what appeared to be portraits. The detail was remarkable, suggesting an artistic sensitivity that contradicted the rough mountain man reputation. Elias looked up as they approached, his grey eyes taking in Martha and Annie with a measured gaze that revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Mrs. Keene." His voice was deep and quiet, with the careful pronunciation of a man who didn't waste words. "Mr. Ward." Martha's throat felt dry despite the cold. "I was hoping we might speak privately." His gaze shifted to Annie, who was staring at him with open fascination. "Little miss, would you mind holding my horse for a moment? She's gentle as a lamb, but she likes company while I finish checking her shoes." Annie nodded eagerly, reaching up to pat the mare's nose. Elias handed her the lead rope, and Martha was surprised to see how naturally he interacted with her daughter. No awkwardness or impatience, just the calm assurance of someone accustomed to putting others at ease. "What brings you out in this cold, Mrs. Keene?" Martha had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, but now that the moment had arrived, the words seemed to crumble in her mouth. "I understand you might be in need of household help." Something flickered in Elias's eyes, surprise perhaps, or concern. "Where did you hear that?" "Jeremiah Polk mentioned you might be looking for someone to keep house for you. I have debts, Mr. Ward, more than I can pay, and Mr. Polk is demanding settlement." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on the mare's hoof, but Martha sensed he was thinking carefully about her words. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. What exactly is Polk proposing? The directness of the question caught Martha off guard. She had expected him to be more circumspect, to dance around the uncomfortable realities of her situation. "He suggested I might work for you to pay off the debt, household duties, cooking, cleaning, and the child." Martha's heart stopped. "I beg your pardon? Polk didn't suggest you come alone, did he?" Elias's voice was flat, matter of fact. "A man like Polk always has angles to work. What did he say about your daughter?" The awful truth seemed to hang in the air between them like a physical thing. Martha found herself unable to speak, her throat constricted with shame and desperation. "He said you might take her as additional help," she whispered finally. "Kitchen work, tending animals." Elias straightened slowly, and for the first time, Martha saw something like anger flicker across his features. But it wasn't directed at her. His gaze was focused somewhere beyond her shoulder, toward the main street where Polk's store stood. "How much do you owe him?" $73.42. The number seemed to echo in the cold air. It was more money than Martha could hope to earn in months of work, even if such work were available. Elias closed his journal and tucked it inside his coat, then bent to finish checking the mayor's shoes. "And if you can't pay, he'll take the cabin and the mining claim. We'd have nowhere to go. Family back east, none that would take us in." Annie had grown bored with holding the horse and was now making snow angels beside the stable wall, her laughter a bright counterpoint to the heavy conversation taking place nearby. Martha watched her daughter's innocent play and felt her heart breaking all over again. "She's a beautiful child," Elias said quietly. "Reminds me of someone I used to know." There was something in his voice, a note of old pain carefully controlled, that made Martha look at him more closely. For just a moment, his carefully maintained composure slipped, and she saw raw grief in his eyes. "Your daughter?" He didn't answer directly, but his hand stilled on the horse's hoof. "How old is she?" "6. She'll be 7 in the spring." Elias nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. When he straightened again, his decision seemed to have been made. "I'll need to think about this. Can you give me until tomorrow?" Martha's heart sank. She had hoped for an immediate answer, preferably one that would solve all her problems without requiring the unthinkable sacrifice. "Of course. Should I come to your cabin?" "No." The refusal was quick, almost sharp. "I'll find you." As they prepared to leave, Elias called to Annie. "Little miss, come here for a moment." Annie skipped over, her cheeks red with cold and exertion. Elias knelt to her level, reaching into his saddlebag to pull out a small object, a piece of carved wood that Martha realized was a tiny horse, perfect in every detail. "I made this for someone special once," he said, placing it in Annie's mittened hands. "Would you take care of it for me?" Annie's eyes went wide with delight. "It's beautiful. Did you really make it?" "I did, a long time ago." He stood, his expression once again unreadable. "Take good care of it." As they walked home, Annie chattered excitedly about the wooden horse and the kind mountain man, but Martha barely heard her. There had been something in Elias Ward's eyes when he looked at Annie, recognition, longing, and a sadness so deep it made Martha's own troubles seem small by comparison. That evening, after the children were asleep, Martha sat by the dying fire and tried to make sense of what had happened. Elias Ward was not the crude, antisocial man the stories made him out to be. He was educated, artistic, and surprisingly gentle with children. But there were shadows in his past, ghosts that haunted him in ways Martha could only guess at. The wooden horse sat on the mantel where Annie had carefully placed it, catching the last of the firelight. It was a masterpiece of miniature carving, every detail, perfect from the flowing mane to the delicate hooves. This was not the work of a rough mountain man, but of an artist who had poured love and skill into creating something beautiful. Who had he made it for originally, and why had he given it to Annie with such careful ceremony? Martha sensed that tomorrow's answer would involve more than just a simple business arrangement. Whatever Elias Ward decided, it would be driven by forces she didn't yet understand, forces connected to that look of recognition and loss she had seen in his eyes. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault on Pine Hollow, rattling the windows and piling snow against the cabin walls. But inside, Martha felt a strange mixture of hope and trepidation. Tomorrow would bring Elias Ward's answer, and with it, the next chapter of their lives, whatever that might hold. The wooden horse seemed to watch over them in the flickering firelight, a silent guardian carrying secrets from a past that was about to collide with their uncertain future. Martha had the strange feeling that nothing would ever be the same again, though whether that change would bring salvation or heartbreak remained to be seen. Elias Ward arrived at Martha's cabin just after dawn, when the world was painted in shades of grey and gold. Martha had been awake for hours, unable to sleep for wondering what his decision would be. She opened the door before he could knock, finding him standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Keene." His voice was quiet in the still morning air. "Might I come in?" Martha stepped aside, acutely aware of the cabin's shabby condition in the morning light. The children were still asleep in the small back room, their breathing the only sound besides the crackle of the fire she had built up before dawn. Elias moved carefully through the small space, his large frame making the cabin seem even smaller than usual. He stopped before the mantel where Annie's wooden horse stood, and Martha saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "I've thought about your situation," he began, then paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "Polk's proposal isn't what I'd call acceptable." Martha's heart sank. She had prepared herself for rejection, but hearing it still felt like a physical blow. "I understand. Thank you for considering." "You misunderstand me." Elias turned to face her, and she was surprised by the intensity in his grey eyes. "I said his proposal wasn't acceptable. I didn't say I wouldn't help." Hope flickered in Martha's chest, though she tried not to let it show. "What are you suggesting?" "I'll pay your debt to Polk. All of it. In exchange, I'd like to spend time with your daughter, teaching her mountain skills, sharing meals, that sort of thing. Nothing more than what a friend of the family might do." Martha stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You want to pay $73 just to spend time with Annie?" "I do. But why? You don't even know us." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the wooden horse. "I had a daughter once. Her name was Lucy. She would have been about Annie's age now if she had lived." The simple statement carried such weight of grief that Martha felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. Most folks around here don't. Lucy and her mother died of fever 3 years ago, back in Colorado before I came to Pine Hollow. I've been alone since then, and I've gotten used to the solitude. But seeing your little girl yesterday reminded me of things I thought I'd forgotten." Martha tried to process what he was telling her. "You want to pay our debt so you can remember your daughter?" "I want to pay your debt because no child should be bartered away like livestock," Elias said, his voice carrying a hard edge. "And I'd like to spend time with Annie because being around her might help heal something that's been broken in me for too long." From the back room came the sound of the children stirring, and soon Annie emerged, rubbing sleep from her eyes and clutching the wooden horse to her chest. When she saw Elias, her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "You came back. Did you come to see if I took good care of your horse?" Elias knelt to her level, his stern expression softening completely. "I did, and I can see you've taken excellent care of him. I named him Thunder because he looks fast and strong. Is that a good name?" "Thunder is a perfect name." Elias reached into his coat and pulled out something that made Annie gasp with delight, a small silver locket on a delicate chain. "I brought this for you. It belonged to someone very special to me, and I think she would have wanted you to have it." Martha watched as Elias fastened the locket around Annie's neck with hands that trembled slightly. Inside the delicate silver case, Martha caught a glimpse of a tiny photograph, a little girl with dark curls and a bright smile. "She's pretty," Annie said, studying the photograph with serious attention. "What was her name?" "Lucy. She was my daughter, and she was about your age when this picture was taken." Annie looked up at him with the intuitive wisdom that children sometimes possessed. "Do you miss her?" "Every day. My papa is in heaven too. Mama says he watches over us, but sometimes I forget what he looked like." Elias's voice was gentle when he replied, "The people we love never really leave us. They live on in our hearts and in the good things they taught us." Tom and Sarah had emerged from the back room during this exchange, and Martha could see the confusion and wariness in Tom's eyes. At 14, he was old enough to be suspicious of any adult who showed such sudden interest in his family. "Mr. Ward," Tom said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing?" Elias stood, his attention turning to the older boy with the same respect he had shown Martha. I'm proposing to pay your mother's debt to Polk with no expectation of repayment. In return, I'd like permission to spend time with your family, teaching Annie about mountain life, helping with chores around the homestead, sharing meals when it's convenient. And what do you get out of it? Tom's voice carried a protective edge that made Martha proud, even as it worried her. Company, Elias said simply, and the chance to be useful to people who need help. Sarah, who had been listening quietly from the doorway, spoke for the first time. Are you lonely, Mr. Ward? The question, asked with a child's directness, seemed to catch Elias off guard. For a moment, his carefully controlled composure cracked, and Martha saw the depth of his isolation. Yes, he said finally, I am very lonely. Martha found herself moved by his honesty. In a world where men were expected to be self-reliant and emotionally guarded, Elias Ward's admission took courage. I need to think about this, she said. Your offer is generous, but I don't understand why you'd make such a sacrifice for strangers. Because 3 years ago, strangers showed kindness to me when I had nothing left to give in return. A family in Colorado took me in after Lucy and her mother died, fed me, gave me a place to grieve. They asked for nothing except that I pass the kindness along when I was able. Elias moved toward the door, then paused. I'll be in town until tomorrow morning. If you decide to accept my help, send word through Peterson at the stable. If not, I'll understand. After he left, the cabin felt strangely empty, despite being full of children. Annie had curled up in Martha's lap, still studying the photograph in the locket, while Tom paced the small room like a caged animal. There's something wrong with this, he said finally. Men don't just give away that kind of money without expecting something in return. Maybe he's exactly what he appears to be, Martha replied, though she shared some of Tom's suspicions. A grieving father who misses his daughter. Or maybe he's a man who preys on desperate families, Tom shot back. We don't know anything about him except stories. Sarah, who had been quietly observing as usual, offered her perspective. He made Annie smile. Really smile, for the first time since Papa died. It was true. Martha had watched her youngest daughter withdraw more each day since Samuel's death, her natural exuberance dampened by the weight of adult worries she was too young to understand. But with Elias, Annie had been herself again, curious, playful, trusting. What if he's telling the truth? Martha asked. What if he really just wants to help? Then we'd be fools not to take his offer, Tom admitted grudgingly. But what if he's not? The question hung in the air, as Martha struggled with the decision. Accept Elias Ward's help and risk the unknown, or refuse and face certain destitution. Either choice carried dangers, but only one offered hope. That afternoon, Martha walked to Peterson's stable and left word that she would accept Elias Ward's offer. By evening, Jeremiah Polk arrived at her door with a face like thunder and a receipt showing her debt had been paid in full. I hope you know what you're doing, Mrs. Keene, Polk said, his tone suggesting he thought she was making a terrible mistake. Ward paid in gold dust, no questions asked. Man must be mighty lonely to spend that kind of money for companionship. After Polk left, Martha sat with the receipt in her hands, trying to convince herself she had made the right choice. The paper felt fragile, almost too good to be true, but it represented freedom from the crushing weight of debt that had threatened to destroy her family. Annie was already asleep, the silver locket clutched in her small fist, when Elias returned that evening with a wagon full of supplies, flour, salt, sugar, preserved meat, and other staples that would see them through the rest of the winter. You didn't need to do this, Martha protested as he unloaded bag after bag. A family should have enough to eat, he replied matter-of-factly, especially children. As he worked, Martha noticed the care with which he handled everything, the quiet efficiency of his movements. This was a man accustomed to taking care of others, despite his claims of solitude. When the supplies were stored away, Elias lingered at the door as if reluctant to leave. Would it be all right if I came by tomorrow? Annie mentioned she'd never seen a real mountain camp, and the weather's supposed to be clear. Martha looked at her daughter's sleeping form, then back at the man who had quite literally saved their lives. Whatever his motivations, Elias Ward had shown them more kindness in one day than they had received from their own community in months. "Tomorrow would be fine," she said. "And Mr. Ward, thank you for everything." He nodded and disappeared into the night, leaving Martha with a cabin full of food, a debt-free future, and more questions than answers about the mysterious mountain man who had changed their lives with a simple act of generosity. The wooden doll sat on Annie's small bed like a tiny guardian, its painted face serene despite the rough-hewn features. Elias had brought it 3 weeks after their arrangement began, pulling it from his saddlebag with the careful reverence of a man handling something precious. "I carved this for Lucy," he had explained to Annie, who held the doll with the solemn responsibility of a child entrusted with treasure. She loved it more than any store-bought toy. "I thought maybe you might give it a good home." Now, as Martha watched Annie dress the doll in scraps of fabric Sarah had sewn into tiny clothes, she marveled at how much their lives had changed. The cabin was warm, the pantry was full, and her children were laughing again. More importantly, they were safe. Elias had become a daily presence in their lives, arriving each morning just after sunrise and staying until the evening chores were done. He never imposed himself, never made demands, but simply became part of their routine as naturally as breathing. He taught Annie to identify animal tracks in the snow, showed Tom how to repair leather harnesses, and listened with genuine interest to Sarah's quiet observations about the world around them. "Mama, look," Annie called from the window. "Mr. Elias is coming, and he's got something big with him." Martha looked outside to see Elias leading a gentle mare behind his usual horse. The animal was smaller than his own mount, clearly chosen for a lighter rider, and she carried a child-sized saddle that gleamed with careful maintenance. "Good morning, Mrs. Keene," Elias said as he approached the cabin. "I thought it might be time for Annie to learn to ride properly." Annie's squeal of delight brought Tom and Sarah running from the back room. The boy's expression was guarded. He had slowly warmed to Elias over the past weeks, but he still watched the mountain man with protective wariness. "She's too young for her own horse," Tom said. "Not her own," Elias clarified. "Just a friend she can visit. Bella here belongs to a family down in Silverton, but they're spending the winter in Denver. They asked me to exercise her, and I thought Annie might help." It was a gentle fiction, Martha realized. Elias had likely bought or borrowed the mare specifically for Annie, but he presented it in a way that wouldn't make the gift seem overwhelming. Over the following days, Martha watched her daughter blossom under Elias's patient instruction. He taught Annie to approach the mare slowly, to read the animal's moods, to sit properly in the saddle. More importantly, he taught her confidence, something that had been slowly draining away during the hardest months after Samuel's death. "You're a natural," Elias told Annie as she guided Bella through a series of walking turns in the small paddock behind the cabin. "Your father would be proud." The mention of Samuel sent a pang through Martha's heart, but she was surprised to find it was mixed with warmth rather than pure grief. Slowly, carefully, Elias was helping them all heal without trying to replace what they had lost. It was Sarah who made the discovery that changed everything. The quiet middle child had taken to following Elias around like a shadow, observing his work with the intensity she brought to everything that interested her. One afternoon, while Elias was repairing a broken fence post, Sarah found him sketching in his leather journal during a break. "You draw like Papa used to," she said, settling beside him on the fallen log where he sat. Elias looked up from his sketch, a detailed rendering of the mountains rising behind Pine Hollow. "Your father was an artist?" "He drew pictures of the places he wanted to take us someday, cities and oceans and big buildings." Sarah's voice was wistful. "Mama has them in a box under her bed." That evening, when Sarah shyly asked to see more of his drawings, Elias opened his journal for the first time in anyone's presence. The pages revealed a talent that took Martha's breath away: landscapes captured in perfect detail, studies of animals and plants, and portraits that seemed to breathe with life. "This is remarkable," Martha said, studying a drawing of a deer drinking from a mountain stream. "You could sell these in Denver, maybe even back east." Elias closed the journal carefully. "I don't draw to sell. I draw to remember." But Sarah had seen something that excited her artistic soul. "Could you teach me? I mean, I already draw, but not like this." The request seemed to surprise Elias, but he nodded slowly. "I'd be honored to share what I know." From that day forward, the afternoon lessons expanded to include art instruction. Sarah's natural talent flourished under Elias's guidance, and Martha often found them bent over their sketchbooks, discussing light and shadow with the serious intensity of true artists. Tom remained the holdout, maintaining a polite but distant relationship with the man who had so dramatically changed their circumstances. Martha understood her son's caution at 14. He felt responsible for protecting his family, and Elias's generosity seemed too good to be true. The tension came to a head on a cold February morning when Martha found Tom confronting Elias behind the barn. "What do you really want?" Tom demanded, his young voice tight with frustration. "Nobody helps strangers like this without expecting something in return." Elias set down the harness he had been mending and gave Tom his full attention. "You're right to be suspicious. A man your age should question the motives of adults, especially ones who appear in your family's life as suddenly as I have. So what are your motives?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. 3 years ago, I lost everything that mattered to me. My wife and daughter died within a week of each other, and I thought I wanted to die too. I came to these mountains to be alone with my grief, to live like a hermit until the pain stopped, or I did." Tom's defensive posture softened slightly, but he remained wary. "Then I met your family," Elias continued. "I saw your mother's strength, your sister's resilience, and your determination to be the man of the house. But most of all, I saw Annie's innocence, the same joy my Lucy used to have. Being around your family reminds me that life can still be good, that there are still things worth protecting. So you're using us to feel better about losing your own family?" The harsh question might have angered another man, but Elias simply nodded. "In a way, yes, but I hope I'm also giving something back. Your family needed help, and I needed purpose. It seems like a fair exchange." Tom studied the older man's face, searching for deception. "And when you get tired of playing pretend family, what happens to us then? I suppose you'll have to trust me when I say I won't abandon you." Elias replied, "But you're smart to think ahead. That's what a good man does, protects his family by considering all possibilities." Something in his tone, the respect he showed for Tom's concerns, seemed to reach the boy. Martha watched from the cabin window as her son's rigid stance relaxed slightly. "I guess you can stay," Tom said grudgingly, "but I'm watching you." Elias smiled, the first genuine smile Martha had seen from him. "I'd be disappointed if you weren't." That evening, as the family sat around the dinner table sharing the good meal Elias had provided, Martha reflected on how dramatically their circumstances had changed. The cabin was warm, her children were thriving, and for the first time since Samuel's death, she could look toward the future without fear. But something else was happening too, something she hadn't expected and wasn't entirely comfortable acknowledging. As she watched Elias patiently helping Annie cut her meat, listened to him discuss art techniques with Sarah, and saw him treat Tom with the respect due a young man rather than a child, Martha felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. She was beginning to care for Elias Ward as more than just a benefactor or family friend. The realization should have frightened her. It had been less than a year since Samuel's death, and her heart still ached with loss. But there was something about Elias's gentle strength, his obvious love for her children, and his quiet understanding of grief that made her feel less alone than she had in months. As if sensing her thoughts, Elias looked up from his conversation with Annie and caught Martha's gaze. For a moment, the careful distance he maintained seemed to waver, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Then Annie claimed his attention again, and the moment passed, leaving Martha to wonder if she had imagined the connection or if Elias Ward might be feeling something similar. Outside, the wind that had howled relentlessly all winter seemed gentler somehow, carrying the first hints of spring's distant promise. Change was coming to Pine Hollow, and Martha had the feeling that the most significant transformations were yet to come. The faded daguerreotype had been hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Elias's cabin, wrapped in oiled cloth and protected from moisture and time. Annie discovered it by accident when she dropped the wooden doll Lucy, and it rolled under the workbench where Elias carved his figures. "Mr. Elias," Annie called from where she knelt on the cabin floor, her small arms stretched under the furniture. "There's something here besides Lucy." Martha, who had come to the mountain cabin to help Elias prepare for a supply run to town, looked up from the preserve she was organizing. Over the past month, these domestic scenes had become natural. She and Elias working side by side while Annie played nearby. It felt like family, though neither adult had spoken of what was growing between them. Elias set down the bridle he had been repairing and knelt beside Annie. "What did you find, little one?" Annie's fingers had discovered the edge of the wrapped package. She pulled it free and held it up triumphantly, then paused as she felt its weight and shape. "It feels important." Elias went very still. Martha watched his face change as he recognized what Annie held. All color drained from his features, and his hands trembled as he reached for the package. "That's something very private," he said quietly. "Something I thought I'd lost." But Annie, with the innocent curiosity of childhood, had already begun unwrapping the oiled cloth. The daguerreotype emerged slowly, its silvered surface catching the cabin's lamplight. Even before it was fully revealed, Martha could see Elias struggling with emotions he had kept carefully controlled for months. The photograph showed a family, a younger Elias, with his arms around a beautiful woman with dark hair and gentle eyes. Between them stood a little girl of perhaps 5, her face bright with laughter, her small hands reaching toward the camera as if trying to touch the person taking the picture. "Is this your family?" Annie asked softly, her voice filled with the reverence children reserved for truly important things. Elias nodded, unable to speak. Martha saw tears he wouldn't allow to fall, the careful composure that defined him, cracking like ice under spring sunshine. "She looks like me," Annie observed, studying the image of Lucy with serious attention. "Same color hair, same size." "Yes," Elias managed. "She was 6 when that was taken, about your age now." Martha moved closer, drawn by the raw emotion on Elias's face. The photograph revealed so much. This wasn't the solitary mountain man Pine Hollow knew him to be. This was a father and husband who had loved deeply and lost everything. "What was her name?" Annie asked, though Martha suspected she already knew. "Lucy, and this is her mother, my wife Catherine." Elias's voice was thick with memory. "We were happy then, so very happy." Annie studied the photograph with the intensity she brought to all important discoveries. "Where are they now?" The simple question, asked without guile or fear, seemed to unlock something in Elias. He gathered Annie onto his lap, holding her close, as if she were his own child. "They got sick," he said simply. "A fever that came through our town in Colorado. I tried everything, doctors, medicines, prayers, but sometimes, no matter how much we love someone, we can't save them." Martha felt her own eyes fill with tears. She had known Elias was grieving, but seeing the physical evidence of his loss made it heartbreakingly real. The woman in the photograph was beautiful, and the love between the 3 family members was evident in every line of their faces. "Do you miss them terribly?" Annie asked. "Every single day. But you know what I've learned?" Annie shook her head, waiting. "The people we love never really leave us. They live on in our hearts, in the good things they taught us, and in the love we share with new people we meet." He looked up at Martha as he spoke, and she saw something profound in his expression. "Your mama reminds me of Catherine, in some ways strong, kind, devoted to her children. And you remind me that joy is still possible, even after great sadness." Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks at the comparison, but she also felt a deep warmth spreading through her chest. To be compared to a woman Elias had clearly loved completely was both humbling and thrilling. "Can I hold it?" Annie asked, reaching for the photograph. Elias hesitated for only a moment before placing it carefully in her small hands. "It's very fragile. The image is made on metal, not paper like modern photographs." Annie studied the faces with the concentration of someone trying to memorize every detail. "They look happy." "We were. For 8 wonderful years, we were the happiest family in Colorado." Martha watched this exchange with growing understanding. Elias's generosity toward her family, his patience with Annie, his careful distance from her, all of it made sense now. He was a man trying to honor his lost love while opening his heart to new possibilities. "Mr. Elias," Annie said thoughtfully, "do you think Catherine and Lucy would like us?" The question caught him off guard. Martha saw him blink back tears as he considered how to answer. "I think they would love you," he said finally. Catherine always said that love multiplies rather than divides. She believed there was always room for more people in a good heart. "Then maybe they sent us to you," Annie said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that sometimes emerged from children. "Mama says angels sometimes work through people to help others." Elias looked at Martha over Annie's head, and she saw wonder mixed with something that looked like hope. The idea that his lost family might have somehow guided him to theirs was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "Maybe they did," he said softly. "I never thought of it that way before." Martha found her voice, though it came out rougher than she intended. "Catherine sounds like a wise woman." She was. She always knew the right thing to say, the right way to make people feel welcome and loved. Elias carefully took the photograph back from Annie and rewrapped it in its protective cloth. "She would have adored you, children, and she would have understood why I needed to help your family." That evening, as they rode back to Martha's cabin through the gathering dusk, the conversation continued in a more personal direction. Annie had fallen asleep against Martha's shoulder, lulled by the gentle motion of the wagon, leaving the adults free to speak openly. "I owe you an apology," Martha said as they navigated the familiar path. "I've been so focused on your kindness to my children that I didn't fully appreciate the cost to you. Opening your heart again after such loss must be incredibly difficult." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his hands steady on the reins. "It is difficult. For 3 years, I convinced myself that living in isolation was safer than risking more pain. But loneliness is its own kind of suffering." "What changed?" "You did. Your family did." He glanced at her, then back at the trail. "The morning I saw you in town, desperate enough to sacrifice everything for your children's survival, it reminded me that love is always worth the risk, even when it leads to loss." Martha felt her heart racing at the implication in his words. "Elias, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that these past months with your family have been the happiest I've known since Catherine and Lucy died. I'm saying that I care for you, all of you, more than I probably should." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Martha thought of Samuel, of the guilt she felt for developing feelings for another man so soon after her husband's death. But she also thought of the loneliness that had consumed her, the fear that she would never feel truly safe or loved again. "I care for you too," she said finally, "more than I thought possible so soon after losing Samuel, but I don't know if I'm ready for what that means." "I'm not asking you to be ready for anything more than what we have now," Elias replied. "Friendship, companionship, shared care for the children. If more develops in time, we'll face that together. If not, what we have now is more than I dared hope for." His patience and understanding only deepened Martha's growing feelings for him. Here was a man who had loved deeply, lost completely, and still had the courage to open his heart again. He wasn't trying to replace Samuel or rush her into anything she wasn't prepared for. He was simply offering himself as he was, scarred but healing, lonely but hopeful. When they reached the cabin, Tom and Sarah were waiting on the porch, their faces bright with anticipation. Tom had grown increasingly comfortable with Elias over the past weeks, and Sarah had begun to bloom under his artistic instruction. "How was your day in the mountains?" Sarah asked as they climbed down from the wagon. "Educational," Martha replied, thinking of the photograph and the conversations it had sparked. "Mr. Elias showed us some of his personal treasures." Tom stepped forward to help unhitch the horses, working alongside Elias with the easy familiarity of shared tasks. Mrs. Peterson stopped by earlier. She said there's talk in town about spring planting. Folks are making plans for when the snow melts. Martha felt a pang of anxiety at the mention of spring. Their arrangement with Elias had carried them through the harsh winter months, but what would happen when the seasons changed? Would he retreat to his mountain solitude, leaving them to face the challenges of frontier life alone again? As if sensing her thoughts, Elias paused in his work with the harness. Spring will bring new opportunities for everyone, new beginnings, fresh starts. There was something in his tone that suggested he was thinking beyond just the changing seasons. Martha caught his eye and saw a question there, one he wasn't ready to ask, and she wasn't ready to answer, but one that would eventually need to be addressed. That night, after the children were asleep and Elias had returned to his mountain cabin, Martha sat by the fire thinking about the photograph she had seen. Catherine Ward had been beautiful, clearly beloved, and the mother of a child who still lived on in Elias's memory and heart. Could Martha ever hope to fill such a space in his life? Did she want to? The answer came to her gradually, like dawn breaking over the mountains. Yes, she realized. She wanted to try. Not to replace what Elias had lost, but to build something new together, something that honored the past while embracing the future. Outside, the wind carried the first faint promise of spring, and Martha fell asleep wondering if love could indeed bloom twice in one lifetime, and whether she had the courage to find out. The unfinished cradle sat in the corner of the cabin like a monument to abandoned dreams. Martha had avoided looking at it for months, but now, with spring approaching and her feelings for Elias growing stronger each day, she found herself drawn to Samuel's last project. The wood was smooth beneath her fingers, carefully shaped and lovingly detailed, but incomplete, a half-built promise that would never be fulfilled. "Papa was making it for the baby," Sarah said quietly from behind her. Martha hadn't heard her daughter approach, but Sarah's observant nature meant she noticed everything, including her mother's long contemplation of the cradle. "What baby?" Martha asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "The one that never came. I heard you and Papa talking about it sometimes, before he got sick. You were going to tell us after Christmas." Martha's breath caught. She had forgotten that Sarah had always been the listener in the family, absorbing conversations and storing them away like treasures. The pregnancy had been their secret, a Christmas surprise that died with Samuel in the mining accident. "I didn't know you heard us." Sarah moved closer, her hand joining Martha's on the smooth wood. "Are you sad that the baby never came?" The question was asked with the directness children possessed when dealing with subjects adults found too painful to discuss openly. Martha considered her answer carefully. "I was sad for a long time. The baby would have been a part of Papa, and losing that possibility made his death hurt even more. But now?" Martha looked at her daughter's serious face and saw wisdom there that belied her 10 years. "Now, I think maybe it wasn't the right time. Maybe God knew we would need all our strength to get through this winter." The sound of horses outside interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Martha could see Elias approaching with his wagon loaded with lumber and tools. He had mentioned needing to make repairs around their homestead, but she hadn't expected such an ambitious project. Tom and Annie rushed outside to greet him, their enthusiasm evidence of how completely he had become part of their daily routine. Martha followed more slowly, Sarah beside her, both of them curious about what new kindness Elias was planning. "Good morning," Elias called, as he began unloading planks of fresh-cut pine. "I thought today might be good for fixing that loose step on your porch and maybe reinforcing the chicken coop before the spring storms." It was a typical Elias gesture, practical help offered without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. But Martha noticed his gaze lingering on the cabin's windows, and she wondered if he had seen her standing near the cradle. "Can I help?" Tom asked, his eagerness to work alongside Elias evident in his voice. The boy had gradually warmed to the mountain man, recognizing in him a patient teacher and steady masculine presence. "I'd welcome the assistance. Sarah, would you mind sketching the work as we progress? Sometimes it helps to have a record of how things were built." Sarah nodded eagerly, already reaching for her drawing materials. Under Elias's instruction, her artistic skills had flourished, and she took pride in documenting their projects with careful illustrations. As the men worked, Martha and Annie prepared lunch, but Martha found her attention drifting to the activity outside. There was something deeply satisfying about watching Elias and Tom work together, the older man's patient instruction, the boy's eager learning, the natural rhythm they had developed. It felt like a glimpse of what a complete family might look like. When they broke for the meal, conversation flowed easily around the table. Elias asked Tom about his plans for spring planting, listened to Sarah describe a bird she had seen that morning, and helped Annie with a difficult word in the book they were reading together. It was domestic and comfortable, and Martha felt a deep contentment she hadn't experienced since Samuel's death. After lunch, while Tom and Elias returned to their repairs, Martha found herself drawn back to the unfinished cradle. This time, Elias noticed her contemplation. "Samuel was building that," he asked quietly, joining her in the corner where the cradle sat. "Our last project together. He wanted to surprise the other children with news of a new baby coming." Elias studied the craftsmanship with appreciation. He was skilled with wood. The joinery is excellent, and the proportions are perfect. He learned from his father, who was a furniture maker back in Ohio. Samuel always said working with wood helped him think clearly. "May I?" Elias gestured toward the cradle, and Martha nodded. He knelt beside it, running his hands over the unfinished surfaces with the reverence of one craftsman appreciating another's work. "He was planning to carve something here," Elias observed, pointing to a smooth section of the headboard. "Probably flowers or a child's name." "Roses," Martha said softly. "My favorite flower. He carved them on our headboard when we were first married." Elias was quiet for a moment, studying the cradle with thoughtful eyes. "Would you mind if I finished it?" The offer surprised Martha. "Why would you want to do that?" "Because it deserves completion, because Samuel poured love into this work, and that love shouldn't remain unfinished. And because," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "because I think it would help both of us find peace with the past." Martha felt tears spring to her eyes. The idea of completing Samuel's last project felt both heartbreaking and healing. "You wouldn't mind working on another man's creation?" "I'd be honored to." Samuel was providing for his family, even in death, through this work. Finishing it would be a way of honoring his memory while helping you move forward. That afternoon, Martha watched as Elias carefully studied Samuel's construction techniques, measuring angles and examining joints with the patience of a master craftsman. When he began work, his movements were reverent, as if he understood the emotional weight of each piece of wood. Tom joined him after finishing the porch repairs, and Martha was struck by the sight of her son, learning to complete his father's work under the guidance of a man who might someday become his stepfather. The thought should have felt disloyal to Samuel's memory, but instead it felt like a bridge between past and future. "He's sanding it smooth," Sarah observed, sketching the scene with careful attention to detail. "Papa always said the finish was what made furniture beautiful." As the days passed, the cradle took shape under Elias's skilled hands. He worked on it each evening after the daily chores were done, sometimes with Tom's help, sometimes alone while the family watched. The carved roses appeared gradually, not copies of Samuel's style, but Elias's own interpretation, respectful of the original vision while adding his own artistic touch. "It's beautiful," Annie said one evening, running her small fingers over the completed carving. "Will we use it for a new baby?" The innocent question made both adults pause. Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized the implications of finishing the cradle. It suggested the possibility of future children, future family expansions that would require a new father. Elias cleared his throat carefully. "That would be up to your mother to decide, someday, if she chooses to marry again." The conversation hung in the air like smoke from a green fire, impossible to ignore but difficult to address directly. Martha met Elias's eyes and saw question there, not pressure, but gentle hope. "For now," she said carefully, "it's a beautiful reminder that love continues even after loss. That projects begun in love can be completed by caring hands, even if they're not the same hands that started them." That night, as Martha tucked Annie into bed, her daughter asked the question that had been hovering unspoken in the cabin for weeks. "Mama, do you love Mr. Elias?" Martha sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing Annie's golden hair. "What makes you ask that?" "You smile different when he's here, and he looks at you the way Papa used to look when you were wearing your best dress." The observation was so accurate it took Martha's breath away. "What would you think if I did?" Annie considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "I think Papa would want you to be happy, and Mr. Elias makes us all happy." Later, as Martha sat by the fire looking at the completed cradle, she realized that Annie was right. Samuel, who had loved his family above all else, would want them to be safe, cared for, and loved. He would understand that accepting Elias's love didn't diminish what they had shared, but rather honored it by choosing joy over perpetual grief. The cradle sat ready for whatever future might come, a symbol of hope, continuity, and the possibility that love could indeed bloom twice in one lifetime. Outside, the first spring rain began to fall, washing away the last remnants of winter and preparing the ground for new growth. The crumpled legal document lay on Martha's kitchen table like an accusation, its official seals and formal language transforming her warm cabin into something that felt suddenly foreign and uncertain. Jeremiah Polk stood in her doorway with the satisfied expression of a man delivering long-awaited justice, though his version of justice felt more like revenge. "I thought you should know the truth about your benefactor, Mrs. Keene," Polk said, his thin lips curved in what might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "Seems Mr. Ward has been keeping some significant information from you." Martha's hands trembled as she smoothed the document's wrinkled surface. The legal language was dense and difficult to parse, but certain phrases leaped out at her with devastating clarity. Deed of trust, unpaid taxes, foreclosure proceedings, and most shocking of all, current legal owner, Elias Ward. "I don't understand," she whispered, though a cold dread was already forming in her stomach. "What is this?" "Property records, ma'am. Official documentation showing that your dear Mr. Ward has owned this cabin and the surrounding mining claims for over 2 years. Bought them for unpaid taxes long before he ever set foot in Pine Hollow last winter." The words hit Martha like physical blows. She sank into her chair, trying to make sense of what Polk was telling her. "That's impossible. This is my home. Samuel bought this land fair and square." "Your husband bought it, yes, but he failed to pay the territorial taxes for 3 consecutive years before his death. When the tax sale happened, there was only one bidder." Polk's voice carried a note of triumph that made Martha's skin crawl. "Mr. Elias Ward, paying in gold dust and taking legal ownership of not just your property, but half a dozen others around Pine Hollow." Martha's mind reeled as she tried to process this information. The man who had rescued her family, who had paid her debts and shown them such kindness, had he been the legal owner of their home the entire time? Had his generosity been an elaborate charade designed to make her grateful for living on property that was already his? "Where did you get this document?" "Territorial Capital keeps records of all property transfers." "I had my suspicions about Ward's sudden wealth and his interest in local families, so I sent for the paperwork." Polk leaned against the doorframe, clearly enjoying Martha's distress. Turns out our mysterious mountain man has been playing a longer game than any of us realized. The sound of approaching horses made them both look toward the window. Elias was returning from town with Tom and Annie, their faces bright with the excitement of a successful supply run. Martha watched them through the glass, Elias helping Annie down from the wagon with gentle hands. Tom eagerly showing him some purchase from the general store, and felt her heart breaking. Had all of it been lies? The kindness, the attention to her children, the growing affection she thought she saw in his eyes. Was she simply a tenant he was managing, a charity case he felt obligated to maintain? "I'll leave you to discuss this with your landlord," Polk said, straightening his coat with satisfaction, "though I suspect he won't be quite as forthcoming about his motives as you might hope." After Polk left, Martha sat alone with the damning document, listening to her children's laughter outside and feeling more alone than she had since Samuel's death. The security she had begun to feel, the hope she had allowed herself to nurture, all of it felt hollow now, built on foundations she hadn't known existed. When Elias entered the cabin, his face bright with plans for the afternoon's activities, Martha could barely look at him. Annie ran to show her the ribbons Elias had bought for her hair, while Tom excitedly described a new type of plow he had seen at the hardware store. Their innocent trust in the man who had become the center of their world made Martha's betrayal feel even sharper. "Martha?" Elias's voice carried concern as he noticed her pale complexion and rigid posture. "Is something wrong?" Without speaking, she placed the legal document on the table between them. She watched his face change as he recognized what it was, the color draining from his features, his eyes closing briefly as if in pain. "Where did this come from?" "Polk brought it. He wanted to make sure I knew the truth about my generous benefactor." Martha's voice was steadier than she felt. "Is it real?" Elias sank into the chair across from her, suddenly looking older than his years. "Yes, it's real." The simple admission hit harder than any elaborate excuse might have. Martha felt the last of her illusions crumble. "How long have you owned my home?" 2 years, since shortly after I arrived in the territory. "And you never thought to mention this small detail?" The bitterness in her voice made Tom and Annie look up from their treasures, sensing the tension, even if they didn't understand its source. "Children," Elias said quietly, "could you take your new things to your room for a few minutes? Your mother and I need to talk." Tom's expression was wary as he herded his sisters toward the back room, clearly sensing that whatever was happening wasn't good. When they were alone, Elias leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "I should have told you from the beginning. I know how this looks, but it's not what you think." "Then explain it to me. Make me understand how owning my home while pretending to be my savior isn't exactly what it appears to be." Elias was quiet for a long moment, organizing his thoughts. "When I came to Pine Hollow 3 years ago, I was running from my grief. I had money from selling my property in Colorado, and I wanted to disappear into the mountains. The tax sale was happening just as I arrived, and I saw an opportunity to protect families from losing their homes to speculators. Protect them how? By buying the properties myself and allowing the families to continue living on them. I never intended to evict anyone or profit from their misfortunes. I just wanted to prevent worse outcomes." Martha stared at him, trying to reconcile this explanation with her feelings of betrayal. "So you've been playing landlord to half the settlement without anyone knowing?" "I've been trying to help without making people feel like charity cases. Pride is important to folks out here, especially families struggling to make ends meet." "And my family? What were we to you, tenants you felt sorry for?" The question seemed to pain him physically. "At first, yes. I saw a widow with children facing eviction, and I wanted to help. But Martha, you have to believe me, everything that's happened between us, every feeling I've shared with you, has been completely genuine." Martha stood abruptly, pacing to the window where she could see the mountains that had become so familiar over the past months. "How can I believe anything you say now? You've been lying to me since the day we met." I haven't lied. I've withheld information that I thought would hurt you unnecessarily. The same thing. The words came out sharper than she intended. You let me believe I was making independent choices about my family's welfare, when the truth is, we've been living on your charity this entire time. That's not true. You could have left at any point. You could still leave now if that's what you want. Martha whirled to face him, anger and hurt warring in her chest. And go where? With what resources? You've made me dependent on you without my knowledge or consent. I've tried to help you become independent. The supplies, the repairs to the homestead, teaching the children skills, all of it was meant to give you options, not take them away. Options I never knew I needed because you never told me the truth about our situation. Martha felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. I trusted you. My children trusted you. We let you into our hearts, thinking you were choosing us freely, not managing property you already owned. Elias stood slowly, his face etched with regret. Martha, please, let me explain everything. There are other families. Other families you've deceived? Other tenants who think they're friends instead of charity cases? Other families I've helped without them knowing it. The Hendersons, the Caldwells, the widow Morrison I own, all their properties too. I've been quietly maintaining them, paying for repairs, making sure they have what they need without making them feel beholden. The scope of his deception was staggering. Martha realized that much of Pine Hollow's stability over the past few years had been built on Elias Ward's silent intervention. It was generous and well-intentioned, but it was also manipulative in ways she wasn't sure she could forgive. Why? She whispered. Why go to such lengths? Because I had the means to help, and I remembered what it felt like to lose everything. After Catherine and Lucy died, strangers helped me survive. I wanted to pass that kindness along. But secretly, always keeping the power in your hands. Elias had no answer for that accusation because Martha suspected it was true. His help, however well-intentioned, had robbed the recipients of their agency, their right to make informed decisions about their own lives. From the back room came the sound of children's voices, and Martha realized she had to think about more than just her own feelings. Tom, Sarah, and Annie had grown to love Elias, to depend on him not just financially but emotionally. Whatever decisions she made now would affect them profoundly. What happens now? She asked quietly. That depends on you. I can transfer the deed to your name immediately. No cost, no conditions. You can ask me to leave and never come back. You can... Stop. Martha held up her hand, overwhelmed by options that felt simultaneously generous and insulting. I need time to think. I need to understand what's real and what's been orchestrated. Elias nodded, his face grave. Of course. I'll stay away until you decide what you want. As he moved toward the door, Martha felt a pang of loss that surprised her with its intensity. Despite her anger and sense of betrayal, the thought of Elias disappearing from their lives felt like another kind of death. The children, she said, they don't understand any of this. They love you. I love them too. All of you. That's the only thing that's been completely true from the beginning. After he left, Martha sat alone with the legal document and tried to sort through the wreckage of everything she had believed about her life. Outside, spring was coming to Pine Hollow, bringing with it the promise of renewal and growth. But inside her cabin, winter felt like it might last forever. The Congressional Medal of Honor lay heavy in Tom's hands, its bronze surface tarnished with age, but still bearing the unmistakable dignity of the nation's highest military decoration. He had found it wrapped in oiled cloth beneath a loose board in Elias's cabin while searching for the man who had disappeared from their lives 3 days ago. "Mama, you need to see this," Tom called, his voice tight with excitement and confusion. Martha looked up from the letter she was writing, her fourth attempt to express feelings she couldn't quite name or organize, and saw her son standing in their doorway with something that gleamed dully in the afternoon light. "What is it?" "I found it in Mr. Elias's cabin, along with these." Tom spread several documents on the table beside the medal: military discharge papers, commendation letters, and newspaper clippings that painted a picture of heroism Martha could never have imagined. The headlines told an incredible story. Local hero saves entire regiment. Medal of Honor. Recipient vanishes after wife's death. War hero seeks solitude after family tragedy. The photographs showed a younger Elias in full military dress, standing proudly beside other decorated soldiers. "He was a war hero," Sarah whispered, reading over Martha's shoulder with wide eyes. "It says here he saved 47 men from a Confederate ambush during the Battle of Gettysburg." Martha studied the documents with growing amazement and shame. The man she had accused of deception and manipulation was Colonel Elias Ward, recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, veteran of some of the Civil War's bloodiest campaigns. More importantly, every article mentioned his devotion to his men, his refusal to accept praise for actions he considered simple duty, and his reputation for putting others' welfare above his own. "Why didn't he tell us?" Annie asked, climbing onto Martha's lap to get a better look at the medal. "Being a hero is good, isn't it? Some heroes don't like to talk about their heroism," Tom said, his voice carrying a new respect for the man he had once viewed with suspicion. Maybe the war taught him things he'd rather forget. Martha thought about Elias's careful distance from violence, his gentle way with the children, his obvious discomfort whenever anyone mentioned the Civil War. These documents revealed not just his military service, but the burden of survival he carried, the weight of being honored for actions that had cost other men their lives. "Mama," Sarah said quietly, "if he's really a hero, maybe we were wrong about the land business too." The observations stung because Martha suspected her daughter was right. She had been so focused on feeling betrayed that she hadn't considered the possibility that Elias's secrecy came from humility rather than manipulation. A man who didn't speak of saving 47 soldiers probably wouldn't boast about quietly helping struggling families either. "Where did you find these things?" Martha asked. "Hidden under the floorboards, same place Annie found the family photograph. I went to his cabin to look for him when he didn't come to town today like he promised." Tom's expression was troubled. "Mama, there's something else. His saddlebags are gone, and most of his personal things. I think he's planning to leave Pine Hollow for good." The words hit Martha like ice water. In her anger and hurt, she had driven away the best thing that had happened to their family since Samuel's death. Worse, she had sent away a man who was clearly as wounded and isolated as she had been, someone who needed their love as much as they needed his protection. "We have to find him," she said, standing so abruptly that Annie nearly tumbled from her lap. "Tom, saddle the horses. Sarah, pack some food and warm clothes. Annie, bring your heavy coat." "Where are we going?" Annie asked, though she was already moving to obey. "To bring our family back together." The search began at Elias's mountain cabin, which Tom had accurately described as mostly emptied. Martha stood in the space where she had discovered so much about the man she was only beginning to understand, and felt the full weight of what she might have lost through her pride and hurt feelings. The cabin still smelled like wood smoke and leather, still contained the workbench where Elias had carved toys for Annie and taught Tom to repair harnesses. But the personal touches were gone, the photographs, the journal, the small objects that had made it a home rather than just a shelter. "His tracks head north," Tom reported from outside, "toward the high passes. But Mama, there's a storm coming. Look at those clouds." Martha followed his gaze to the western horizon, where dark thunderheads were building with ominous speed. Spring storms in the mountains could be deadly, dropping snow and hail with little warning, creating conditions that could trap travelers for days. "How long ago did he leave?" "This morning, maybe earlier. He's got at least 6 hours on us, and he knows these mountains better than anyone." Martha made a decision that would have terrified her just months ago. "We're going after him. He saved our family when we needed it most. Now it's our turn to save him." The pursuit led them higher into the mountains than Martha had ever ventured, following a trail that grew increasingly treacherous as the afternoon wore on. Tom rode point, reading signs and tracks with skills Elias had taught him, while Martha kept Annie secure in front of her on the saddle. As they climbed, the storm clouds gathered overhead with alarming speed. The temperature dropped, and the first fat snowflakes began to fall, though it was supposedly spring. Martha realized they were riding into the kind of weather that killed unprepared travelers. But the alternative, letting Elias disappear forever, seemed worse than any physical danger. "There!" Sarah pointed ahead to where a thin column of smoke rose from a grove of pine trees. "Someone has a fire." They found Elias's camp in a small clearing, sheltered by overhanging rocks and surrounded by his pack animals. He looked up as they approached, his face cycling through surprise, concern, and something that might have been hope before settling into careful neutrality. "You shouldn't be up here," he said, rising from beside his fire. "There's a storm coming that could trap us all." "We came to bring you home," Annie announced, sliding down from Martha's horse and running to him before anyone could stop her. "Mama says you're our family now." Elias caught the little girl in his arms, his composure cracking visibly. "Annie, I don't think your mother wants me to be part of your family anymore." "She does. She's just confused because she didn't know you were a hero." Annie pulled the medal from her coat pocket, where she had insisted on carrying it. "Tom found this. Why didn't you tell us you were brave?" Martha dismounted and approached slowly, unsure of her reception. "We found the military records too, and I realized something important." Elias set Annie down but kept one hand on her shoulder, as if afraid she might disappear. "What's that?" "I realized that I accused you of lying when what you were really doing was protecting people's dignity, including mine." Martha's voice caught slightly. "A man who doesn't talk about saving 47 soldiers probably wouldn't brag about quietly helping families either." The first thunder rolled across the mountains, closer than it should have been. Elias looked at the darkening sky with obvious concern. "We need to get to shelter. There's a cave system about half a mile from here, but we need to move now." As they gathered their gear and animals, Martha found herself working beside Elias, with the natural coordination they had developed over months of partnership. The crisis pushed aside their personal conflicts in favor of immediate survival needs, getting 4 people and several animals to safety before the storm hit in full force. "Elias," she said as they secured the last of the pack animals, "when we get through this, I want to start over. I want to understand everything, the land ownership, the other families, all of it. But I want to understand it together, not as secrets you keep to protect me." He looked at her across the snowy clearing, and she saw hope warring with caution in his expression. "And if you decide you can't accept the situation once you know everything, then we'll figure out what comes next. But we'll figure it out as a family." The storm hit just as they reached the cave, wind and snow and lightning transforming the mountain into a hostile, alien landscape. But inside the shelter, with a fire crackling and the children safe, Martha felt more hopeful than she had in days. Whatever else happened, they had found Elias before he disappeared forever. The conversation about their future could wait until the storm passed, but Martha was no longer afraid of what that conversation might bring. Love, she was learning, was strong enough to weather any storm, including the ones people created for themselves. Martha's mother's Bible lay open on her lap, its worn pages illuminated by the dancing firelight in the cave. She had carried it with her during the frantic search for Elias, and now, as the storm raged outside their mountain shelter, she found herself turning to the passage where her mother had pressed wildflowers from her wedding day 33 years ago. The delicate petals had long since faded to brown, but they still held their shape between the thin pages, preserved like memories between the lines of scripture. Martha touched them gently, remembering her mother's words about love, being patient, kind, and enduring. How different her life might have been if she had remembered that wisdom before driving Elias away with her wounded pride. "Is that Grandma's Bible?" Sarah asked, settling beside her mother on the cave floor. The children had adapted to their unusual shelter with the resilience of youth, turning the enforced wait into an adventure rather than a crisis. "It is. I was reading the verses she marked about forgiveness and new beginnings." Martha glanced across the cave to where Elias sat with Tom and Annie, teaching them to identify different types of rock formations by firelight. Even in these circumstances, he remained the patient teacher, turning every moment into a lesson that might serve them well. "Mama," Sarah said quietly, "are you going to marry Mr. Elias?" The direct question caught Martha off guard, though she realized she should have expected it. Sarah had always been the observer in the family, watching adult relationships with the keen insight children possessed when they felt safe enough to be curious rather than fearful. "I don't know, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" "Because you look at him the way you used to look at Papa sometimes, and he looks at you like Papa looked at you when he thought we weren't watching." Sarah paused, considering her words carefully. "And because Annie asked him if he was going to be our new Papa, and he got that sad, happy look that grown-ups get when they want something but don't think they can have it." Martha felt her heart clench at the image of Elias receiving such an innocent question from Annie. What must it have cost him to hear that from a child who reminded him so much of his own lost daughter? What did he tell her? That it wasn't his decision to make, that some things had to be decided by grown-ups together, and that sometimes people needed time to figure out what would make everyone happy. It was such a perfectly diplomatic answer, protecting Annie's feelings while acknowledging the complexity of adult relationships. Martha realized that Elias had been navigating the delicate balance between his growing feelings for their family and his respect for her autonomy since the day they met. The storm outside intensified, and Martha was grateful for Elias's quick thinking in getting them to shelter. Lightning illuminated the cave entrance in stark flashes, and the wind howled with a ferocity that spoke of nature's awesome power. In the face of such forces, human conflict seemed small and manageable. "Tom," Elias called softly, "can you help me bank this fire so it burns safely through the night? We want to keep warm without filling the cave with smoke." Martha watched her son work alongside the man who had become his mentor and father figure, noting the easy communication between them and Tom's obvious respect for Elias's knowledge. Her eldest child had grown so much over the past months, gaining confidence and skills under Elias's patient guidance. As the evening deepened and the children settled into sleep, Martha found herself alone with Elias by the dying fire. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words and unresolved feelings, but it no longer felt hostile. Instead, it carried the weight of two people who needed to find their way back to each other. "I owe you an apology," Martha said finally, her voice barely audible above the storm. "For my anger, for my accusations, for not trusting in the goodness I should have seen from the beginning." Elias poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing toward the cave ceiling. "You had every right to be angry. I should have told you about the land ownership from the start." "No, I think I understand now why you didn't. You were trying to preserve our dignity, our sense of independence. I reacted like a woman who felt powerless, instead of recognizing that you were trying to give us power over our own choices. But you were right about one thing: I did keep the control in my hands. Even with the best intentions, I was making decisions about your life without your knowledge or consent." Martha shifted closer to him, close enough to see the regret etched in his features by the firelight. "Why did you really help us, Elias? And this time, I want the complete truth." He was quiet for so long that Martha wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully guarded emotions. "Because when I saw you that day in town, desperate enough to consider sacrificing your daughter for your family's survival, I saw myself 3 years ago. Broken, alone, convinced that I had nothing left to offer the world." He paused, his gaze fixed on the fire. "You reminded me that love makes us capable of impossible courage, and that sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones too proud to ask for it. And now, what do you want now?" Elias looked at her then, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight and something deeper, hope, longing, and a love he had been afraid to fully acknowledge. "I want to be part of your family, not as a benefactor or protector, but as a husband and father who earns his place through daily devotion rather than financial assistance." His voice roughened with emotion. "I want to love you the way you deserve to be loved, and I want to help raise your children to be strong, capable adults who know their worth." Martha felt tears spring to her eyes at the raw honesty in his words. This was the truth she had been seeking, not the careful diplomacy he showed the children or the measured generosity he offered the community, but the genuine feelings of a man who had learned to love again, despite devastating loss. "What about Catherine and Lucy? Can you love us without betraying their memory? Catherine would have adored you and the children. She always said that love multiplies rather than divides, that there's always room in a good heart for more people to cherish." Elias's voice was soft with memory. "And Lucy would have wanted me to be happy. She never liked to see anyone sad, especially me." Martha pulled the Bible closer, feeling the weight of her mother's pressed flowers and the wisdom they represented. Love was patient. Love was kind. Love endured all things, including the mistakes people made when they were afraid of being hurt again. "I love you," she said simply, the words carrying all the certainty she had been afraid to acknowledge. "I love your gentleness with my children, your quiet strength, your ability to see what people need before they know it themselves. I love that you honor the past while building toward the future." Elias reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt like a promise. "And I love you, Martha Keene. I love your fierce protection of your family, your courage in the face of impossible choices, your capacity to forgive even when you've been hurt." Outside, the storm began to show signs of weakening, the lightning flashes coming less frequently and the wind losing some of its howling intensity. Inside the cave, two wounded hearts had found their way back to each other, ready to build something new from the ashes of old sorrows. "When we get back to Pine Hollow," Martha said, "I want you to tell me about all the families you've helped. I want to understand the full scope of what you've been doing, and I want to help you do it better." "Together?" "Together, as partners in every sense of the word." Martha squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses earned through years of hard work and careful craftsmanship. "And Elias, when you're ready, when it feels right, I'd like you to ask me to marry you properly." His smile transformed his entire face, erasing years of carefully maintained solitude and replacing them with joy so pure it took Martha's breath away. "I'll ask when the timing is perfect," he promised. "When the children are all present and the moment feels right for beginning our new life together." As they settled down to sleep on opposite sides of the fire, maintaining propriety even in their unusual circumstances, Martha felt a peace she hadn't known since Samuel's death. Tomorrow they would return to Pine Hollow and begin the work of building a life together, but tonight it was enough to know that love had won over fear, trust over suspicion, and hope over the wounds of the past. The hand-forged iron key gleamed in the morning sunlight as Elias placed it carefully in Martha's palm, its weight substantial and warm from his touch. He had worked on it through the night while she slept, using tools from his saddlebags and the cave's natural acoustics to muffle the sound of metal on metal. Now, as dawn painted the mountains in shades of gold and rose, he offered it to her, with the solemnity of a man making a sacred vow. "What is it?" Martha asked, though something in her heart already understood the symbolism of the gesture. "A key to whatever door you choose to open," Elias replied, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "To our cabin, to your heart, to the future we might build together. I made it to remind us both that the choice is always yours to make." Martha turned the key over in her hands, marveling at the intricate design Elias had managed to create with such simple tools. Tiny roses were etched along the shaft, the same flowers Samuel had planned to carve on the cradle, the same blooms her mother had pressed in the Bible. It was a bridge between past and future, acknowledging what had been while embracing what could be. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling with snow that would melt by afternoon. The children were stirring in their makeshift beds, and Martha could hear Annie's sleepy voice asking questions about breakfast and whether they could explore the cave system before heading home. "Mama," Tom called softly, "the horses are ready whenever you want to start back." Martha looked around the cave that had sheltered them through the storm and realized it would always hold special significance in their family's story. This was where she had chosen love over fear, where Elias had offered her a key to their shared future, where they had all learned that some storms were worth weathering together. "Let's go home," she said, and was surprised by how naturally the word home included Elias now. The journey back to Pine Hollow took most of the morning, winding down mountain trails still slick with melting snow. They rode in comfortable companionship, the children chattering excitedly about their adventure, while the adults exchanged glances that spoke of shared understanding and mutual commitment. As they approached the settlement, Martha noticed people coming out of their homes to watch their unusual procession. Word would spread quickly about the widow, Keen, and her children spending the night in the mountains with Elias Ward, and she found she didn't care what the gossips might say. Her reputation was less important than her happiness, and her children's future mattered more than social conventions. "Mrs. Keen." Jeremiah Polk emerged from his store as they passed, his face wearing the expression of a man who had discovered interesting news. "I trust you've resolved your property situation with Mr. Ward." Martha felt Elias tense beside her, but she straightened in her saddle and met Polk's gaze directly. "Mr. Ward and I have come to a complete understanding about our arrangement. Thank you." There was something in her tone that warned Polk against pursuing the subject further. He nodded curtly and retreated to his store, but Martha suspected this wouldn't be the end of his interest in their affairs. When they reached the cabin, Martha was struck by how much it felt like coming home to a place where she truly belonged. The building looked the same as when they had left it, but everything felt different now, warmer, more welcoming, full of possibilities instead of just memories. "Annie," Elias said as they dismounted, "would you like to help me take care of the horses? They've worked hard these past 2 days." "Can I brush Thunder? He's my favorite." Annie skipped alongside Elias toward the small barn, her trust in him complete and unshakable. Sarah and Tom began unloading their gear, working with the efficient teamwork that had developed during their mountain adventure. Martha watched her children and marveled at how resilient they were, how quickly they had adapted to the idea of Elias as a permanent part of their family. "Mama," Sarah said as they carried supplies into the cabin, "when are you and Mr. Elias getting married?" The direct question made Martha pause in the doorway. "What makes you think we're getting married?" "The way you look at each other now, and the way he made you that key." And because Annie asked him this morning if she could call him Papa Elias after the wedding, and he got all happy and teary at the same time. Martha felt her heart swell at the image of Annie making such a request, and Elias's emotional response. What did he tell her? That he would be honored to be her Papa Elias, if that's what she wanted and if you said yes when he asked properly. That afternoon, as Martha worked in her garden planning the spring planting, she found herself thinking about the key Elias had given her and what it represented. The choice, he had said, was always hers to make. After months of feeling powerless, of having decisions forced upon her by circumstances beyond her control, the freedom to choose her own future felt like the most precious gift imaginable. When Elias returned from settling the horses, he found her sitting on the porch steps, turning the iron key over and over in her hands. He settled beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Having second thoughts?" he asked gently. "Having first thoughts, actually. Real thoughts, instead of just reactions based on fear or anger or desperation." Martha looked at him, taking in his patient expression and kind eyes. "I've been thinking about what kind of marriage I want this to be." "And what conclusion have you reached?" I want it to be a partnership built on honesty and mutual respect. I want us to make decisions together, to share both the burdens and the joys. I want my children to see what a healthy marriage looks like, so they'll know what to look for when their time comes." Elias nodded slowly. "Those are good goals, worthy goals. I also want us to help other families the way you've been helping them, but openly, as a community effort rather than secret charity. People need to keep their dignity while they accept assistance." "I'd like that. Catherine always said that helping others was best done hand in hand, not from a distance." Martha stood, decision crystallizing in her mind with sudden clarity. "Elias Ward, I have something to ask you." He rose as well, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he recognized the formality in her tone. "Yes, ma'am? Would you do me the honor of becoming my husband and a father to my children and a partner in building something good and lasting here in Pine Hollow?" The role reversal, Martha proposing to Elias instead of waiting for him to ask, seemed to delight him. His laugh was rich with joy and surprise. "Martha Keene, I would be honored and thrilled to marry you, to love your children as my own, and to build whatever kind of life makes you happiest." From inside the cabin came the sound of excited squealing as the children, who had obviously been eavesdropping, erupted in celebration. Tom's deeper voice could be heard over his sister's exclamations, declaring that it was about time and that he approved of their choice. As Elias pulled Martha into his arms for their first real kiss as an engaged couple, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From desperate widow to beloved wife-to-be, from isolated mountain man to treasured family patriarch, they had both traveled farther than the miles between their separate lives suggested. The key to their future lay not in the iron token Elias had forged, but in the choices they would make together each day, to trust instead of doubt, to share instead of hide, to build instead of simply survive. And as the afternoon sun painted their mountain valley in shades of hope and promise, Martha knew they had found their way home to each other at last. The new family photograph sat proudly on the mantel beside Samuel's old mining tools, a testament to the truth that love could bloom twice in one lifetime. In the sepia-toned image, Martha wore her best dress, the blue one, with tiny roses that Elias had bought for their wedding, while he stood beside her in a freshly pressed suit that made him look more like the distinguished war hero he was than the rough mountain man Pine Hollow had believed him to be. The children clustered around them in the photograph, with faces bright with genuine happiness. Tom stood tall and proud at 14, his hand resting protectively on Annie's shoulder in a gesture that spoke of his growing maturity. Sarah held her newest sketchbook, the one Elias had given her as a wedding gift, filled with drawings of their expanding family and the life they were building together. And Annie, now 7 and glowing with the security of belonging to a complete family again, clutched the wooden doll Lucy in one hand, while the other rested on the small swell of Martha's abdomen. Spring had come fully to Pine Hollow, bringing with it renewal and growth that extended far beyond the greening meadows and blooming wildflowers. The cabin Martha had once feared losing had become the heart of a thriving homestead, expanded with Elias's careful additions and warmed by the laughter of children who no longer worried about having enough to eat. "Mama, the baby's kicking again," Annie announced from her perch beside Martha on the porch swing Elias had built to replace the old steps. "I think she wants to come out and play." Martha placed her hand over the spot where Annie's small palm rested, feeling the strong movements of the child who would be born in late summer. This baby, conceived in love and anticipated with joy, would grow up knowing both parents from the beginning, a gift that made Martha's heart swell with gratitude every time she thought about it. "She might be a he," Tom pointed out, from where he was helping Elias repair a section of fence. At 15, he had grown tall and strong under his stepfather's guidance, developing both the practical skills needed for mountain life and the confidence that came from knowing he was valued and respected. "Either way, the baby will be loved," Sarah added, looking up from the letter she was writing to an art teacher in Denver who had expressed interest in her work. Under Elias's instruction, her natural talent had flourished to the point where she was already receiving commissions for portraits from families throughout the territory. Elias straightened from his work and smiled at his family, an expression that still sometimes caught Martha by surprise with its pure contentment. The careful distance he had once maintained was gone, replaced by the easy affection of a man who had learned to trust in happiness again. "The fence is finished," he announced, "which means we're ready for the new horses Peterson is bringing next week." The expansion of their small ranch was just one sign of how their lives had grown and prospered. Elias's quiet wealth, no longer hidden, had been put to work, improving not just their own property, but the entire community of Pine Hollow. The school had a new roof, the church had glass windows instead of oiled paper, and several families had received anonymous gifts that everyone now understood came from the ward's generosity. "Will you teach me to break them properly?" Tom asked, his eagerness evident despite his attempt to sound casual. "We'll do it together," Elias replied, and Martha heard in those words the promise of shared adventures and mutual learning that had come to define their blended family. A rider approaching from town interrupted their peaceful afternoon. Martha recognized Dr. Dyrex, Harrison's horse, and felt a familiar flutter of concern. The doctor's visits usually meant someone in Pine Hollow needed medical attention. "Afternoon, folks," Dr. Harrison called as he dismounted. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Elias replied, moving to take the doctor's horse. "What brings you out our way?" "Two things, actually. First, I wanted to check on Martha and the baby, see how you're feeling as we get closer to your time." Martha submitted to the doctor's gentle examination with patient good humor, understanding that frontier medical care required more vigilance than city doctoring. When he pronounced both mother and baby healthy and thriving, she felt the familiar wave of relief that had accompanied each medical visit since learning she was expecting. "The second thing," Dr. Harrison continued as he packed his medical bag, "is that I have news from the territorial capital. Your application for the school expansion has been approved, along with the funding you requested for teacher salaries." Martha and Elias exchanged glances of satisfaction. The school project had been one of their first joint ventures in community improvement, a way to ensure that Pine Hollow's children, including their own, would have access to quality education without leaving their mountain home. "When will construction begin?" Elias asked. "Early fall, after harvest." The Territorial Education Board was impressed by your proposal to combine practical skills training with traditional academics. They think it could become a model for other rural communities. After the doctor left, the family gathered for their evening meal, with the contentment that came from shared purpose and mutual affection. The conversation flowed easily around the table, Tom describing his plans for the new horses, Sarah sharing her ideas for documenting the school construction through drawings, Annie chattering about the fairy houses she was building in the garden with rocks and flowers. "Papa Elias," Annie said as Martha served dessert, "will you tell us the story about how you and Mama fell in love?" It had become a favorite bedtime story, though Annie asked for it at least once a week and never seemed to tire of hearing how a desperate widow and a lonely mountain man had found each other when they both needed saving. "Well," Elias began, his eyes twinkling with amusement, "it starts with a very brave mama who was willing to do anything to protect her children, and a sad man who had forgotten that life could still be good." Martha listened to the familiar tale, marveling at how Elias told it, emphasizing her courage rather than her desperation, focusing on the hope their meeting had brought rather than the pain that had preceded it. He had a gift for finding light in difficult circumstances, for helping others see their own strength even when they felt powerless. As the evening wound down and the children prepared for bed, Martha found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace and prosperity. The woman who had stood in Jeremiah Polk's store a year ago, desperate enough to consider selling her daughter to pay her debts, felt like a different person entirely. "What are you thinking about?" Elias asked as they settled on the porch swing to watch the stars emerge over the mountains. About how much can change in a single year. About how many times I thought our story was ending when it was really just beginning. Elias took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm in the absent way that had become one of his expressions of affection. Do you ever regret the choices we made? Never. The answer came without hesitation. Even when I was angry about the land situation, even when I thought you had deceived me, I never regretted letting you into our lives. You saved us in every way a family can be saved. We saved each other, Elias corrected gently. You and the children gave me reasons to live fully again, to believe that love was still possible even after devastating loss. From Annie's bedroom window came the soft sound of her singing herself to sleep, a lullaby Elias had taught her that his own mother had once sung to him. The melody drifted across the evening air, blending with the sound of crickets and the distant call of a night bird. She's going to be a wonderful big sister, Martha observed, one hand resting on her growing belly. All three of them will be. Tom's already talking about teaching the baby to ride, and Sarah wants to document every milestone with drawings. Martha smiled at the image of their expanded family, at the love that would surround this new child from the moment of birth. Unlike her pregnancy with Annie, which had been shadowed by financial worries and uncertain futures, this one was filled with anticipation and joy. Elias, she said quietly, do you think Catherine and Lucy would approve of what we've built here? He was silent for a moment, considering the question with the thoughtfulness he brought to all matters involving his first family. I think they would be proud of how we've chosen to honor love by creating more of it. Catherine always said that the best way to heal a broken heart was to use it to help mend others. As if summoned by their conversation about family, Tom appeared in the doorway, wearing the serious expression that meant he had something important to discuss. Mama, Papa Elias, could I talk to you both for a minute? They made room for him on the porch, and Martha felt a familiar flutter of maternal concern. At 15, Tom was navigating the complicated transition between childhood and adulthood, and she wanted to make sure he felt supported through every step of the process. What's on your mind, son? Elias asked, and Martha noticed how naturally the term of endearment had become part of his vocabulary. I've been thinking about the future, about what I want to do with my life. And I've decided I want to study engineering, maybe go to college back east and learn to build things that last, bridges, buildings, things that help communities grow and prosper. Martha felt her heart swell with pride at her son's ambition, even as she experienced the bittersweet realization that his dreams would eventually take him away from Pine Hollow. That's a wonderful goal, Elias said. What can we do to help you prepare? I was hoping you might help me write to some colleges, ask about their programs and what kind of preparation they require. And maybe, if it's not too much to ask, help me figure out how to pay for it. Tom, Martha said gently, there's something you should know about our family's resources. Over the next hour, they explained to Tom the full extent of Elias's holdings, the properties throughout Pine Hollow, the mining claims that had proven more profitable than anyone had expected, and the investments that ensured their family's financial security for generations to come. More importantly, they shared their philosophy about using wealth responsibly, helping others while preserving dignity and self-reliance. So you're saying I could afford to go to any college I wanted? Tom asked, his voice filled with wonder. You could afford to go to any college you're qualified to attend. Elias corrected, money can open doors, but you'll still need to work hard and prove yourself worthy of the opportunities. Tom nodded soberly, understanding the distinction. I want to earn my place, not just buy it. But knowing I have your support means everything. As they said goodnight and Tom headed inside, Martha reflected on how perfectly he embodied the values they were trying to instill in all their children, ambition balanced with humility, dreams tempered by responsibility, and individual growth that never forgot the importance of family and community. He's going to make us proud, Elias said, echoing her thoughts. He already has, They all have. The baby moved again, a strong kick that made Martha gasp and laugh simultaneously. Elias placed his hand beside hers, his face lighting up with wonder as he felt his child's movements for the first time that evening. "Hello there, little one," he murmured. "We're all so excited to meet you." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the sounds of their peaceful valley and warmed by the knowledge of the love that filled their home, Martha thought about the photograph on their mantel and all it represented. Sometimes the most beautiful pictures were the ones that captured not just faces, but the happiness that made those faces glow with inner light. Their story had begun with desperation and deception, with a widow's impossible choice and a lonely man's hidden kindness. But it had grown into something neither of them could have imagined, a love story that honored the past while embracing the future. A family that proved blood wasn't always thicker than choice, and a community that thrived when people looked out for one another. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, unchanging witnesses to the changing seasons of human lives. And in Pine Hollow, in a cabin warmed by love and brightened by hope, the Ward family settled into sleep with the contentment that came from knowing they had found their way home to each other at last. Outside, the wind whispered through the pine trees with the same ancient voice that had sung over these mountains for countless generations. But inside, something new had taken root, a love that would grow and flourish and spread its branches wide enough to shelter not just one family, but an entire community that had learned the true meaning of caring for one another.